Nobody on Guadalcanal expected him to make it through the night. Not with the jungle shaking under 1,000 enemy boots, not with his machine guns overheating, and definitely not after his last belt of ammo ran dry. John Basilone should have died in that foxhole. Any other Marine would have. The Japanese forces charging his line were convinced the position was finished. Even his own officers, miles away in the dark, assumed the worst. But Basilone wasn't done. Before the sun came up, Marines advancing toward his sector found something they couldn't explain at first: a single foxhole, torn apart, half collapsed, surrounded by the bodies of dozens of enemy soldiers, and one exhausted, mud-soaked Marine still standing. He had survived with no ammo, and somehow, in just 3 brutal hours, he had turned that tiny patch of earth into one of the most legendary last stands in Marine Corps history. This is the story of how it happened. John Basilone didn't grow up looking like a future legend. He was the 6th of 10 kids in a working-class Italian-American family in Raritan, New Jersey. What he lacked in discipline at school, he made up for with raw toughness. Teachers couldn't keep his attention, but nothing could keep him out of a fight. If trouble showed up, John usually met it halfway. One story from his childhood followed him for the rest of his life. At 7 years old, he climbed into a pen with a 1,000-pound bull because he decided, on the spot, that he wanted to pet it. The bull launched him 20 feet across the yard. Most kids would have cried. John stood up, brushed off, and tried again the next week. Nobody knew whether it was courage or stubbornness, but everyone agreed he didn't have much fear in him. When he was older, Basilone found something that finally matched his instincts: boxing. He and his brothers trained with whatever they could find: clotheslines for jump ropes, old axes for conditioning, bare hands for mitt work. He had no formal coaching, just timing, aggression, and a natural ability to read another man's movement. By the time he joined the Army in 1934, boxing wasn't a hobby. It was part of who he was. In the Philippines, he fought 19 matches across the services and knocked out all 19 opponents. No judges, no close calls, clean knockouts. That reputation earned him the nickname Manila John. But behind the victories, something else was growing. Basilone started to believe he had a calling, not to stand in a ring, but to fight for real. Not staged rounds, not sparring matches, but the kind of fight that demands everything a man has. He didn't know where that calling would lead him yet, but the world was changing fast, and war was coming. And when it arrived, it would put every instinct he had, the stubbornness, the toughness, the close quarters intuition, to the ultimate test. By 1942, Basilone had left the Army, worked a few civilian jobs he hated, and finally re-enlisted, this time in the Marine Corps. He wanted a fight that mattered, and the Marines were heading straight into one. Across the Pacific, Japan had built a wall of fortified islands, tightening its grip over the region. Then, the Imperial forces began constructing an airfield on a small island called Guadalcanal. If Japan finished that runway, it could cut off American supply lines and strike deep into Allied territory. The U.S. couldn't let that happen, so the Marines landed first. At first glance, Guadalcanal didn't look like the place where legends are made. It was a steaming jungle, thick with insects, disease, and mud that swallowed boots whole. But the real threat wasn't the terrain. It was the darkness. The Japanese army specialized in night attacks, silent infiltrations, sudden charges, flanking movements nobody saw coming until it was too late. The Marines had to adapt fast. They learned passwords, counter-infiltration drills, and defensive tactics under the cover of absolute blackness. When Basilone arrived with the 7th Marines, the situation on the island was already unstable. The Americans held Henderson Field, the half-finished airstrip that everything depended on. But the Japanese wanted it back so badly that they were willing to send thousands of men through the jungle to overrun it. The Marines were low on food, low on medical supplies, and often low on ammunition. But morale stayed high because of leaders like Chesty Puller and hard fighters like Basilone. They trained relentlessly, drilled weapon teams, dug fighting positions, and studied the terrain around Henderson Field like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Then came intelligence reports. A massive Japanese force under General Kawaguchi was moving to strike the perimeter. Their objective was simple: break through the Marine line, seize the airfield, and wipe out the American foothold before reinforcements could arrive. Every Marine dug in deeper. Every machine gun position was checked and checked again. Every foxhole became a lifeline. For Basilone, This was the moment he had been preparing for since he first stepped into a ring. No referee, no bell, just a thin line of Marines staring into a jungle that hid thousands of enemy soldiers waiting for nightfall. The greatest battle of his life was only hours away. Night fell over Guadalcanal like a curtain. No moon, no horizon, just the weight of the jungle pressing in on every sense. The only light came from the red glow at the ends of cigarettes, quickly crushed out as the Marines settled into silence. Basilone and his section manned 2 water-cooled Browning machine guns on a ridge, protecting the right flank of Henderson Field. 15 Marines. 2 guns. A sector nearly half a mile wide. Too wide for comfort. Wide enough that if the Japanese broke through anywhere, they could wrap behind them before anyone knew what happened. Close to midnight, the jungle started to move. At first, it sounded like wind pushing through leaves. But there was no wind. Then the shapes appeared, dark, ragged silhouettes slipping between the trees. Hundreds of them. Then more. And then the shouting started. A deafening wave of banzai cries burst out of the tree line as the Japanese infantry charged uphill straight toward Basilone's position. The Marines opened up immediately. The Brownings hammered out long, controlled bursts, their tracers slicing red arcs through the blackness. Enemy soldiers dropped by the dozens, but more kept coming, tripping over the fallen, clawing forward on adrenaline and orders. The guns grew so hot the barrels shimmered. Basilone switched them himself, working in a rhythm that looked almost unreal. Fire, change barrel, fire again, guide the loaders, redirect the fire lanes. His entire world shrank to the 2 machine guns and the 15 men he refused to lose. Bodies began piling up in front of the wire. Some lay still. Others crawled forward even after taking hits, clutching rifles or grenades. The air turned into a haze of gunpowder and steam rising off the water-cooled jackets. Still, they kept coming. Then one gun jammed. Basilone dropped into the foxhole, stripped it, cleared it, and had it firing again in seconds. But the Japanese assault wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was getting heavier. By the second hour of fighting, Marines were screaming for more ammunition. The left flank needed belts. The right flank needed belts. And Basilone's own position, responsible for stopping the bulk of the attack, was running dangerously low. Every belt they fired brought the enemy closer. Then it happened. The loader slapped the next ammo box. Empty. The last belt rattled dry through the receiver. There was no more. 15 Marines holding back over 1,000 attackers, with 0 ammunition left. For a moment, the foxhole went quiet except for the pounding of feet moving closer through the darkness. Nobody said the words out loud, but the thought hit everyone the same way. This is it. But Basilone didn't freeze. He didn't wait. He didn't accept the ending that seemed guaranteed. He grabbed a machete, a loaded Colt .45, and sprinted barefoot into the black jungle, straight through the same terrain the Japanese were pouring through, looking for an ammunition cache he knew might already be overrun. Every shadow could have been an enemy. Every branch he brushed could have given away his position, but he moved with the instincts of a boxer slipping between punches. Fast, silent, decisive. Minutes felt like an hour. Then the Marines heard it. Footsteps, crashing through brush. Hands went to triggers. Everyone braced for impact. A figure burst out of the darkness, drenched in mud and sweat, carrying ammo belts wrapped around his neck, replacement barrels under one arm, and canteens of cooling water under the other. It was Basilone. He had made it through enemy lines, found ammunition, and fought his way back with enough supplies to keep the guns alive a little longer. But it still wasn't enough. The Japanese broke through the wire again. More men fell. The ammo dwindled once more, and the enemy kept pressing forward. The firefight was about to turn into something even more brutal. By the time Basilone dragged the ammunition back into the foxhole, the situation had already shifted from desperate to nearly impossible. The Japanese had punched through a gap on the right, spilling in behind the machine gun line. Marines were being hit from angles they couldn't cover. Shadows moved between shadows. Muzzle flashes lit up, faces far too close for comfort. The Brownings fired again as Basilone fed the belts. But even with fresh ammo, the guns couldn't keep up with the number of attackers pressing in from every direction. The barrels glowed. The water hissed and steamed. Spent casings piled so high, they slid under the Marines' elbows. Then, more of his men went down. One gun crew was reduced to 2 men. The other, to just 1. Basilone moved between foxholes, grabbing hot barrels with rags, laying down fire wherever the line buckled, shouting for Marines to reposition into tighter angles. He fought like the entire sector depended on him, because it did. But ammunition doesn't stretch forever. And soon, again, the belts ran out. This time, there was no supply run left to make. The enemy was already too close. Movement flickered just beyond the lip of the foxhole. Breathing. Whispers. Footsteps on wet soil. The next wave wasn't coming with rifles blazing. They were climbing into the foxholes. The fight turned hand to hand, instantly. A Japanese soldier lunged forward. Basilone met him with a shoulder drive and the butt of his .45. Another grabbed the edge of the foxhole. Basilone slammed his forearm across the man's throat, drove him backward, and finished the fight in the mud. A third dropped in from the flank. Basilone pivoted, pinned him with a knee, and used the only leverage the cramped space allowed. Nothing about the fight was clean or structured. It wasn't technique. It was instinct, speed, and refusal. The same aggression he'd sharpened in boxing rings across the Philippines now kept him and the remaining Marines alive inside a collapsing defensive line. In the flicker of gunfire, you could see it. Basilone striking, pivoting, grabbing, throwing bodies off the berm so he could see the next attacker coming. Mud covered everything. Faces, rifles, hands that slipped on sweat and rain. By the end of the 3-hour struggle, the ground around his position told the story better than anyone could. 38 enemy soldiers lay dead within yards of his guns, many from machine gun fire earlier in the night, but a shocking number from the brutal, close-quarters combat that followed. When reinforcements finally pushed through and reached his position, they didn't find a fortified post. They found a battlefield carved into a crater, and in the center stood Basilone, exhausted, bruised, burned by hot barrels, hands swollen from the fight, still holding the line he refused to give up. When the first thin light of dawn crept over Guadalcanal, the battlefield finally came into focus. The jungle haze lifted just enough for the Marines, pushing forward to see what remained of the night's fight. They expected to find the right flank collapsed. They expected to find the guns overrun. They expected to find bodies, American bodies, where the machine gun line had once stood. But what they saw instead made them stop in their tracks. The entire slope below Basilone's position was littered with enemy dead, dozens of them. Some lay tangled in the wire. Others were sprawled across the mud as if they had fallen mid-charge. A few were still inside the foxholes, where the fighting had turned so close that the difference between life and death came down to inches. It didn't look like a defensive position. It looked like a last stand. Basilone himself was barely upright. His utilities were torn, burned, and soaked through with rain and sweat. His hands were swollen from striking and grappling. His arms were scorched from handling red-hot machine gun barrels. He breathed like every inhale was a negotiation with pain, but he was alive. Chesty Puller arrived not long after, mud to his knees, jaw set, taking in the scene with a veteran's understanding of what it meant. He'd fought enough battles to recognize when a position should have been destroyed, and he knew immediately. This one had survived because of a single Marine and the handful of men who refused to break under him. Puller walked the perimeter, stepping around shell craters and twisted metal, counting bodies almost without meaning to. 38 enemy soldiers dead in the sector. One machine gun line still standing. When he reached Basilone, he didn't offer a speech. He didn't need to. A nod was enough, the kind only one fighter gives another after they've both lived through something that should have killed them. Word spread fast across the regiment. The right flank held. The bridge to Henderson Field was safe. The Japanese assault had failed, and the Marines began to understand what Basilone had done. He had kept the entire airfield, and possibly the entire campaign, from collapsing in a single night. The legend started right there, in the mud and steam of a foxhole that should have fallen hours earlier. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue, but its turning point had already passed. The Marines held the airfield. The Japanese offensive shattered against a line that never should have survived the night, a line anchored by one exhausted machine gunner who refused to surrender even when his last belt of ammunition ran dry. In the weeks that followed, Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor. He didn't talk about the night with pride or drama. When a reporter asked how he managed to hold the position, he gave the same quiet answer every time. "I just happened to be there." But everyone who walked the ground afterward knew better. They knew how many lives were saved because he stood his ground. They knew Henderson Field might have fallen without him. They knew that sometimes, in war, a single foxhole becomes the center of the world. Basilone didn't return home to sit behind a desk or enjoy the safety he had earned. He went back into the fight, choosing danger over comfort, service over fame, And though he fell later on Iwo Jima, his legacy never faded. His story remains a reminder that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a man alone in the dark, outnumbered, out of ammunition, deciding that the only acceptable outcome is to keep fighting. That's why they couldn't believe he survived. And that's how he turned 3 hours on a jungle ridge into one of the greatest last stands in Marine Corps history.